those of you who don't know me, I'm Danny Wignall. I'm currently mission enabler with a responsibility for evangelism, working out of Church House, or out of my office actually at the moment. And before that, I was incumbent at Shottermill near Haslemere for 11 years. And I'm really passionate about being alongside leaders, encouraging, enabling, supporting leaders, because of course the way that we are able to best do discipleship and mission and evangelism is from a place of being with Jesus ourselves, from a place of that being that non-anxious presence. So it goes without saying that I certainly haven't got all the answers. I'm on the journey as much as you are, and I suspect that today I will probably be reminding you as much of stuff you already know as saying anything that you haven't heard before. So anyway, as we get going, what I'd really like to do is just to pause and to just have 1 minute of quiet or silence. And someone reminded me recently that silence isn't the absence of anything, it's actually inviting the fullness of God into our lives. So we're just going to have 1 minute of silence, and if you need a suggestion of what to do, one suggestion might be as you breathe out to give to God all of your anxiety, and as you breathe in to just breathe in the presence of Jesus. So 1 minute to be silent, breathe out all our anxieties, and breathe in the presence of Jesus. So let's just do that now for 1 minute. Okay, well, welcome to those of you who've just joined us. We're going to, before we go into a little bit of an overview of what we're doing in this next hour, we just want to do a quick poll, a quick Zoom poll. We might as well use the technology. So yeah, you can see on your screens, hopefully, how are you feeling right now? So this is anonymous. We won't know who said what. Just tick 2 of those adjectives that describe how you're feeling right now. Okay, so very interesting. We have a combination in terms of the most popular, as you can see there, of feeling hopeful and exhausted. And interestingly enough, I was running a retreat last week with some other leaders, and we had exactly the same response. That there were the 2 top things, that people were feeling both exhausted but also feeling hopeful. And also we need to acknowledge the other feelings there as well, of sadness and frustration, anxiety, which we're thinking about, discouraged, but also thankful, patient. So I've just encouraged you just to be who you are right now, just to bring those feelings before God as we consider what it means to be a non-anxious presence in this world. And the way we're going to do this is we're going to first of all look at the work of Edwin Friedman, who was both a Jewish rabbi and a family therapist. And he wrote a book just over 20 years ago called A Failure of Nerve, Leadership in the Age of the Quick Fix. And he talks about the world's desperate need for a non-anxious leader. And he defines a non-anxious presence as someone who provides a calm, cool, focused and collected environment that empowers others to be relaxed. So our time together is basically going to be in 2 halves. The first half is going to be looking at the 5 characteristics that Friedman identified of an anxious culture. We'll then have some time in a breakout room to discuss that a bit. And then in the second half, we're going to look at the 5 practices of Jesus, and there's obviously plenty more than 5, but these are just the 5 I've sort of identified that might be helpful. 5 practices of Jesus to counter an anxious culture. And as I said, this is only going to be a very brief introduction to this subject, but I hope it will stimulate further thinking and reflection. And again, to remind you of some of the things you already know, but actually often find it quite difficult to put into practice. So I'm just going to share my screen. As I mentioned, this comes from the work of Edwin Friedman, and I think it's particularly pertinent, isn't it, at this time? I think, you know, before the pandemic, there did seem to be some anxiety in the air, as it were, and even more so now. Over the last year or so, we've really seen levels of anxiety increase, and maybe you've noticed that in yourself as well. And I hope this taking some time out today, and by the way, well done for taking the time out to be here, because, you know, one of the challenges in self-care, self-leadership is actually just taking the time to do that. So well done for doing that, because not everyone manages. And in fact, there's quite a few people who signed up for this webinar who are not here. And I suspect other things have just crowded in. So you will obviously have to work out for yourself how you're going to take this forward and what things you're going to put into practice. And I'll give you a bit of time to do that at the end. One of the things that Friedman says is that what we do need in this world is a non-anxious presence. And as I say, what does that look like? What does it mean to be really present with someone? I want you to just think for a moment, think about someone who's really listened to you. Think about a time when you've really been listened to. What did that feel like? What did that feel like to be really listened to? Please use chat if you're happy to do so. Yeah, healing, humbling, feeling valued. Yeah, empowering, affirming. So part of what I'm trying to set out in this time is just to remind us that actually that's part of our calling, isn't it, as ministers and leaders, is to be people who are present. Be people who are present with those that we lead, those that we serve. And of course, it's really hard to be fully present with somebody when we're anxious, when we're distracted, because giving our attention, our full attention to someone is one of the best gifts that we can ever give. So Friedman contends that the West is built around the myth of progress. And he says this is almost like a religion, you know, that we just assume that we're heading towards a utopian future, or certainly that things are just getting better and better. And that's because we know more, we understand things better than we did yesterday or last year. And certainly we do things better than previous generations. And we can view history as sort of a linear thing, and that we're just, in fact, not just linear, but going upwards, that it's sort of upward progress all the way. And of course, this is in contrast to many other cultures, particularly some ancient cultures and some Eastern and African cultures today, which see history as much more cyclical, a bit like seasons. And I think, you know, we're not going to dwell on this, but I think if we look at scripture, we'll see that that's probably more of a scriptural view of history, that it's seasonal, it's cyclical. And that's one of the great things about scripture, isn't it, is that we look at people from thousands of years ago and we see people just like us, even though in a different context. And so Friedman's analysis said broadly 2 things. The West is progressing economically and technologically, if we look at the advances in medicine and that sort of thing. But actually, he says, and this is the important thing, he says it's regressing emotionally and relationally. He says our society has gone into an emotional regression that is toxic to well-defined leadership. He said that over 20 years ago, and in fact, it still seems to be true, doesn't it? If not even more so. There was a poll by the Pew Research in America that said 39% of Americans said they were 39% of Americans said they were more anxious in 2019 than in 2018. I wonder what they would say about 2020 and 2021. And many of us have experience of Generation Z, you know, the oldest of Generation Z were about 21. And many of us have experience of those folk. And And certainly my own children, I've seen anxiety. It's seen, and in amongst their friends, there just seems to be a lot more anxiety around. There seems to be maybe a bit of an absence of certainty about the future, or about meaning and purpose, or even about identity. So what Friedman does is he identifies 5 characteristics, and we're just going to go through those very quickly. So you can see the first one on your screen there is reactivity. And that's when, we just have intense feelings all the time. And he calls it a consistent vicious cycle of negative reactions to each member to events and one another. And a non-anxious presence, in contrast though, which obviously we'll think about more detail in a moment, but is someone who can manage his or her own reactivity to the automatic reactivity of others, and therefore be able to take stands at the risk of displeasing. And I don't know about you, but it does feel, doesn't it, that we're living in an age where there's just a disproportionate reaction to everything. That there is just we're just constantly reacting, whether it be social media, whether it be the news, and actually living in a constant state of reaction is exhausting. And if you wanted to be a little bit cynical about it, you could say that the digital news cycle thrives off this activity because it generates hits, drives up advertising revenue, all of those sort of clickbait things that we see down the sides of our screens when we're looking at other stuff that make us feel anxious, or make us feel, oh, we're missing out if we don't click on that thing that's going to change our lives, or that exercise regime that's going to make us the person that we've always wanted to be. So that's the first of his characteristics of an anxious society. The second one is the herding, what he calls the herding instinct. The herding insect or the herding instinct, a process through which the forces of togetherness triumph over the forces for individuality and move everyone to adapt to the least mature members. I found this incredibly insightful if I think about some of the culture we experience in churches, where we end up giving disproportionate airtime and airspace to the least mature members of the congregation, because they're usually the loudest and they're usually the ones that say the most. And at worst, this can become a sort of mob mentality. And again, we can see this in the culture around us, can't we? Where actually everything gets very binary, and everything becomes very black and white, and opinions become really amplified. And you can't just have an opinion without it becoming something that people react against quite strongly. And then we become afraid of offending people. And as I say, it's often the loudest and most provocative voices that hold sway. Friedman says, such herding endeavors to accommodate the disruptions of the immature and of those who think in terms of their rights rather than their responsibilities. And so chronically anxious teams and organizations allow dysfunctional or immature members to stay and even lead in order to maintain peace, even at the expense of growth and renewal. And so chronically anxious environments regress to the maturity of the most unhealthy of its members. And then the third is blame displacement, which he calls an emotional state in which family members focus on forces that have victimized them rather than taking responsibility for their own being and destiny. And so we end up focusing on the surface symptoms within the culture of our churches in particular, instead of really getting beneath the surface and trying to diagnose the underlying assumptions, the underlying culture and values that are causing the problem in the organization. And we end up becoming, again, reactive to what is going on and just trying to change things on the surface rather than really going for a deep change in culture and helping to be able to become more mature. And what happens, Friedman says, is that a cultural paralysis sets in and a fear of offending sets in, which creates a block to deep change and renewal. And interestingly, he says this blame does nothing but put the power of change into the hands of others. And again, I know I found myself at times blaming church members for why some great scheme of mine hasn't happened. Whereas actually it's much more about me and my own sense of victimhood, and not taking responsibility for the things that I can. And then the fourth characteristic is a quick fix mentality, which means that we have a low threshold for pain that constantly seeks symptom relief rather than fundamental change. You can see how each of these builds upon the previous one. In other words, we tend to choose the least painful solution. We get used to getting what we want almost at the moment. And, we're in a culture, aren't we, of instant gratification. We can just literally buy that thing and it can be delivered tomorrow, even on a Sunday. I have to really resist that temptation at times, with Amazon in particular. And what this means in our culture in general is we have a low toleration, a low threshold of pain, which keeps us from persevering and enduring. We look for silver bullets. We look for quick solutions. And I'm sorry to say, there's definitely not any of those today. There are no silver bullets to this. Another thing that Friedman says is organizations primarily adapt themselves to their most dependent, recalcitrant, and anxious members, rather than to the energetic, the visionary, the imaginative, and the motivated. And I can certainly think of some PCCs I've worked with that fit that description. But again, it's hard as a leader, isn't it, not to be dragged down by those attitudes, to actually be working with those who are energetic, the visionary, the imaginative, and the motivated, because our desire to pastorally care for those people who are anxious and recalcitrant and dependent sometimes takes over. And we need to watch for that. And then the final and fifth thing is the lack of well-differentiated leadership. Now, this is a whole subject on itself, but one definition of differentiation is remaining connected to people, yet not allowing my reactions or behaviors to be determined by them. So in other words, we make decisions based on what we discern God saying to us. Obviously, we value other people's opinions and we try and do that collaboratively, but ultimately we make decisions because it's what we believe is right. That God has called us, the way God has called us to lead, having integrity. There's a clear boundary between me and other people. Yes, I'm relational. I'm in relationship with people, but I'm not absorbing the emotions of others around me, especially their anxiety and their anger. A lovely phrase that John Mark Comer uses, he says, it doesn't permeate the membrane of my spirit, and that I can be present with people in grace and love, but not sucked into the atmosphere of anxiety. The quote I've put on there is from Pete Scazzaro, and he says, my primary task, like Jesus, is to calmly differentiate my true self from the demands and voices around me, discerning the desires, vision, pace, and mission the Father has given me. And of course, we cannot lead well, can we, in an environment of anxiety, blame shifting and emotional resilience, blame shifting and low emotional resilience. And the only way to stop this cycle is to inject into the middle of this culture, of this cycle, is a non-anxious presence. So in our second half, we're going to look at that. How can we be that non-anxious present and be at the center, in a sense, of the communities that we lead to bring about change and renewal. So what I want us to do now, so there's a lot of stuff I've just packed into 10 minutes there, but what I want us to do now is just have a chance to process that, to go into our breakout rooms. And I want you to look at these three questions. First of all, do you identify with, oh, no, that's not the one. Do you identify with Friedman's 5 characteristics? If so, which one do you identify with most? And then just to begin to think what makes you non-anxious. We're going to come back at 2:30, so you've got 8 minutes. Yeah, so without further ado, David will now put us in our breakout rooms, and I'll see you shortly. Welcome back. Please, yeah, actually, I know this is not what you're supposed to do on Zoom, but if you want to unmute yourselves, because I think it'd just be really good to, rather than having that hurdle of unmuting yourself, it'd be great to hear any sort of reactions, anything that came out of your group conversation before we move on to hopefully some counter anxiety practices. Anyone want to share anything?
We began to explore the difficulties of being a well differentiated leader.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's one of the hardest things, I think. Yeah, absolutely, Harry. Thank you.
I think we summed it up that a key thing seems to be about just taking a bit of a step back, slowing things down, taking some time, so that you're not being rushed into things, rushed into reactions, rushed into whatever. That seemed to
Brilliant.
cover over all of it.
Yeah, thank you. You've already said my first point, Claire, so that's great.
Good.
Slowing down. Anyone else?
I think you're right, Danny, about how they're all somewhat interconnected and they all sort of feed off each other.
Yeah.
I think that came out of our discussions.
Yeah, I mean, some people have described it more like a cycle, you know, that you just get into this sort of vicious cycle of those different ways of being.
I think, I mean, Danny and I were talking about how countercultural some of this can be. Not just countercultural with the world, but really countercultural in our churches. Actually being unanxious as a leader stands as a real challenge to some people in our churches, and people can find that really difficult, particularly if we do it quite well. Yeah, I think it's really countercultural.
Yeah. And what I found when I began to practice some of this stuff that we're going to talk about in a minute, but, you know, we're beginning to think about it already, when, you know, trying to be this sort of unanxious leader, some people reacted quite badly because it made them feel bad. Because they wanted to justify their 70-hour weeks and their crazy lifestyle and, you know, activism. So for someone to seemingly be doing a reasonable job without being that, sort of challenge their notion that the only way to possibly be successful was to run at 100 miles an hour and, you know, say yes to everything and, you know, approach the whole of life as a sort of some big sort of challenge that they have to overcome by their sort of written determination.
One of the things I find hardest in this whole non-anxious thing is not accepting other people's anxiety when they try and give it to you, especially 5 minutes before the service starts on a Sunday morning. You don't really need somebody else's anxiety. It's theirs to deal with, not
absolutely better. Yeah. And, you know, part of this is just finding practices that will help us, you know. So for that sort of situation, you actually, you know, just firmly say to somebody, I'm sorry, but, you know, please speak to me at the end of the service, you know. But yeah, always 5 minutes before the end of the service or before the beginning of the service. I mean, I know some people will, if you've got the sort of church that allows you to do this, you know, find a place where you can go and pray and really not be disturbed before the service starts. But I know that's easier said than done. Yeah. Any other particular thoughts? Did anyone begin to think about some practices that help them to be non-anxious? And that's what we're gonna think about next.
Yeah, I was talking a little bit because, as you know, I mean, I've read the book. I've got it here. I love this book. I bought it in quite a difficult time a few years ago, and for me, I was just saying about how it's the idea of not empathizing with a pathogen, which I think is linked to the herding instinct thing and the well differentiated leader, because you know, at the time I'm dealing with somebody who is quite toxic and realizing that everybody wanted to pander to them and everybody wanted to kind of do the pastoral thing, which would be to be nice and to look after them and whatever, and despite the fact that actually the person was causing complete chaos and was actually quite dangerous. And so you know, I realized at that point that, you know, having, you know, before ordination, having run a hostel, having been a homeless hostel manager and having to deal with quite difficult and potentially violent situations, and actually violent situations, that I you know, that idea of you don't empathize with pathogen. You know, if you've got a cancer in your body, you do everything you do to put a very firm boundary against that and ensure that it doesn't infect the whole body. And yet, and I was allowed to do that as a hostel manager. I was allowed to be, they called me the dragon. I was in a nice way, sometimes. But nice, you know, I was allowed to do that. I was allowed to say, actually, no, enough, go. But actually, we don't allow ourselves to do anything like that in church. We kind of go, oh, you know, poor people, let's just keep looking after them a little bit more and see if we can kind of make that happen. And sometimes actually, I mean, it's not pastorally good for them. It's about them taking responsibility. But actually, it's, you know, are we prepared to damage the entire body of the church for the sake of you know, a person we're claiming to help who we're not actually helping, and who is you know, is a crazy maker, to use Julia Cameron's phrase. It's you know, or a pathogen, really. So my little watchword is don't empathize with the pathogen. And I've got a cat.
That's super helpful, Jelaine. Reminds me of another story which I can't quite remember the details of, but the punchline is Cage the Tiger. You know, it's about a tiger being introduced into a sort of friendly forest, and you know, the lamb getting really upset about the fact this tiger kept hassling the lamb, and in the end the lamb leaves and the tiger remains. So yeah, no, that's brilliant, Jelaine. Thank you so much. Well, great. Thank you for your contributions. That's, you know, really good. And I hope, you know, all I'm doing today really, I hope, is stimulating your thinking and reminding you of stuff that you already know. So I just wanted to look very briefly at this scripture that I mentioned in the blurb. Let me just share my screen. Hopefully you can see that, from Matthew 11. Come to me, all you that are weary and are carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. And I was really challenged as I was thinking about this, thinking, you know, and I found myself saying this to others as well, you know, do I really believe that Jesus wants to give me a yoke that fits me really well? It's sort of bespoke, made for my shoulders. Do I really believe that my burden should be light? Because I think often as leaders, we just assume that this is our lot, you know, that it's going to be a heavy burden. It's a self-sacrificial ministry, and therefore it's going to be uncomfortable. And of course, in many ways that is true. But I think I know for myself, I've often taken on burdens that are not mine to carry. And I think that's a really good question to ask yourself. Are the burdens that I'm carrying the ones that Jesus has asked me to carry, or are they just ones that have been put upon me by others, or because I find it difficult to say no, because I want to appear to be nice, or I want to appear to have high capacity? And particularly in Surrey, that can be a challenge, in some parts of Surrey anyway, where we're working with very high capacity people, whatever that means, and whether that's a good thing or not. And so we think we've got to keep up with that sort of way of working. And then I also found, as always, Eugene Peterson's interpretation of this passage really helpful. Are you tired, worn out, burned out on religion? That's quite telling, isn't it? Come to me, get away with me, and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. What an amazing phrase, the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me and you'll learn to live freely and lightly. I absolutely love that. And so what we're going to think about now is some of what Eugene Peterson calls those unforced rhythms of grace. What are those counter activities, those things that can counter some of those things that can make us anxious and make us a non-anxious presence? And I would argue that these are practices that Jesus put into place as well. David and I were also talking in our little conversation about the fact that often we're really busy because we're lazy. And that sounds a really counterintuitive thing to say. And it was Eugene Peterson again who said, I am busy because I'm lazy and I'm vain. When I first read that, because my training incumbent gave it to me, he knew me too well, I was really angry. I thought, I'm not lazy. I'm working all these hours, you know, I'm working evenings and weekends, and I'm, you know, putting all these hours in. How could you possibly say I'm lazy, Eugene? You don't know me at all. And then I read what he meant by that. And what he meant was that we're too lazy to put into place those really important self-care, self-leadership parts of our work, because it is our work. We're too lazy to put those into place because actually, frankly, it's easier to say yes. And then the vanity thing, well, you know, it's a vanity badge to say when people say to us, oh, you must be so busy, vicar. For those of us who are vicars, you know, oh, yes, I'm really busy. Yes. Oh, you know, oh, woe is me. It becomes sort of a badge of honor that we are busy. And it's again, part of our culture. To be busy is seen as a good thing. But actually it's about vanity. It's about what other people think about us rather than what God thinks about us ultimately. And again, I know that I've been incredibly prone to that, wanting to portray a particular image of myself as successful, competent, all of those things. And of course, it's not wrong to be successful and competent, but when those things become idols in our lives, then it's vanity. So this is about being intentional with our time, intentional with our priorities. And some of you will know the phrase a rule of life. We haven't got time to go into that really, but I know that our clergy wellbeing documentation is encouraging us to have a rule of life. And I really encourage you to look at that if you haven't already. Just simple, small steps that you can put in place to help you to become more anxious, less anxious, should I say. I love what Corrie ten Boom said. She said, worrying is carrying tomorrow's load with today's strength. Carry 2 days at once. It is moving into tomorrow ahead of time. So let's look at these 5 practices. So Claire's already mentioned this, a slow down spirituality. And I love this quote from this book called The 3 Mile an Hour God, by a Japanese author. He says, God walks slowly because he is love. If he is not love, he would have gone much faster. Love has its speeds. It is an inner speed. It is a spiritual speed. It is a different kind of speed from the technological speed to which we are accustomed. It is slow, yet it is Lord over all other speeds, since it is the speed of love. And the 3 mile an hour God comes from the reality that Jesus wouldn't have gone anywhere much faster than 3 miles an hour, because he walked pretty much everywhere, apart from when he was on a donkey. And yet we think that we've got to run everywhere. Well, I often think I've got to run everywhere. As someone reminded me at the beginning of my incumbency at Shottermill, it's a marathon, not a sprint. But even that can be misleading, because, you know, marathon runners can still run quite fast. So how do we pace ourselves and attune ourselves to the rhythm of Jesus? You know, he rarely seemed to be in a hurry, did he, Jesus? Apparently when Dallas Willard was asked to describe Jesus in one word, he thought for a moment and he said, relaxed. So Jesus' pace of life is much slower than ours. And he had space in his life. He had space to be interrupted, actually, to attend to those around him. There were margins, I guess, is another way you could put it. That we know that he only did what he saw the Father calling him to do. Do we do that? Debs and I were having this conversation absolutely this morning about just recognizing that we'd begun to run a bit fast over recent weeks, and just needing to notice that in ourselves and to just recognize we need to slow down. The second practice, Sabbath, or rest. This has become incredibly important to myself and Debs actually over recent years. Sabbath is an absolute gift to us, the gift of 24 hours a week where we can just stop, where we don't have any jobs, we don't have any to-do lists, that actually we can just be. And of course, Sabbath has given us a gift to a people who are in slavery. And the 10 Commandments were, of course, given to a people who come out of slavery to say to them, this is how you now should live. You are no longer slaves. And the Sabbath commandment, as you probably know, is the longest one. I think there's a reason for that, because we find it the easiest to break. Oh, well, you know, I'll stop when I've done everything on my to-do list. Well, guess what? You'll never do that. Well, certainly I've never got to the end of my to-do list. I don't know about you. And there's a distinction, I feel, between a day off and a Sabbath. A day off is doing all the other work. Often, that's what I used to do on my day off. I used to do all the work I hadn't had time to do during the week. You know, things like getting the washing done, or paying the bills, or sorting the car out, or doing the garden, or whatever it might be. So we've got to, I would really encourage you, if you don't do this already, to find, even if you start with a half a day or a few hours of just genuinely stopping all of your work, maybe stopping looking at screens if that's a particular issue for you. It certainly is for me. When do you really have time to stop? And Pete Scazzaro, who's written stuff about emotionally healthy discipleship and leadership, he says the most important aspect of Sabbath rest is delight. I love that word, delight. What do you delight in? What brings you joy? What brings you delight? And if you're struggling to think about the answer to that, then that you might want to see that as a bit of a warning sign on the dashboard if you've forgotten how to delight. You know, that was certainly true for me a few years ago. I'd just forgotten all of the things that I love doing, you know, hiking in the mountains, making music, also, you know, having a nice meal with a glass of wine. You know, my life was just too full to do those things. So one of the things I did, and this ties up with our next point about friendship, was I committed to going wild camping with a friend of mine at least once or twice a year. And that just gives me such joy. I've also my spiritual director said to me to see songwriting as a spiritual discipline. And that's really helped me to sort of just set that aside time to write songs. You'll probably never hear them, and that's probably quite a good thing, but it gives me great joy and delight. I'm going to move on because I'm running out of time. So the third one, deep friendship and community. And I love this quote from the Northumbria community. This was in our daily, mine and Deb's daily prayer the other day. We too should have those friends in our lives who would hold our story for us when circumstances might steal courage and hope. Isn't that wonderful? Hold our story when circumstances might steal courage and hope. And again, you will know this, that for those of us who are in leadership, and those of us who are clergy, you know, and particularly if we are only taking one day off a week, you know, when do we see our friends? Because most of us have moved around. Our friends live in different parts of the country, let alone different parts of the world. So we actually have to intentionally make time to see them. And that is actually a spiritual discipline, to invest and nurture in our friendships, the ones that sustain us, those sort of lifelong nurturing friendships. And yes, we might be fortunate to have found one or two of those in our parishes, but generally that's the exception, not the rule. Generally, for most of us, those deeper friendships are outside of the parish. And I would absolutely 100% encourage you to not skimp on investing in nurturing those friendships. I'm so grateful for the people that God has brought into my life since childhood, who I count as brothers. You know, and I was with one of them the other day and on Zoom, of course, and said that to them, and it was just such a wonderful moment because he said the same to me too. And we need these people who are going to help us to just remember who we are, that we're not just doing machines, you know, doing for God. Okay, let's move on. The fourth one, contemplative prayer. I don't know about you, but my life can sometimes look like that, completely out of kilter scale, that my doing for God far outweighs my being with God. Contemplative prayer is simply being with Jesus, with our head on his chest and just being. Not even bringing our needs to him particularly, but just being, that companionship, that deep sense of just being and abiding. I love John 15 when Jesus talks about abiding in the vine, abide in me, rest in me. But so many of us have a life that looks like this. And as we take on more responsibility, we end up spending less time. Well, I know I had times where even I was doing more and had more responsibility, my time with God was less and less because I couldn't fit it in. It should be the other way around, shouldn't it? That our being with God is the first thing that we do, is our first priority. And actually, that's okay. It's part of our work. It's part of our calling, particularly those of us who are ordained. It's part of our calling to be with Jesus, to lead out of a place of being, that our doing flows from being with God. Our doing for God flows from a place of being with God. And there's this, as we see in the life of Jesus, this ebb and flow between contemplation and activity. Contemplation and activity. The Northumbria community talk about the ebb and flow of Holy Island, which twice a day, Lindisfarne, is cut off from the mainland. When do we cut ourselves off from the work and the activity? Not to just So we retreat in order to engage. We retreat, engage, ebb and flow. And we need a rhythm of that, at least daily, but ideally more than once a day, maybe 2 or 3 times a day, just to pause and stop and remember who we are. And then the 5th one, and I'm going to rush this one a bit, I'm afraid. The 5th one is indifference. This is a phrase that Ignatius of Loyola coined, and one translation of the Spanish actually translates this as freedom. But let me read what Ignatius himself said. We should not fix our desires on health or sickness, wealth or poverty, success or failure, a long life or a short one. For everything has the potential for calling forth in us a more loving response to our life, forever with God. Our only desire and our one choice, that I think that should say, should be this: I want and choose what better leads to God's deepening life in me. So we're free and at an emotional level from the need for our life to go a certain way, to relinquish control, to yield, surrender to God's will, and not be so fixed on a particular outcome, but to actually be in that place of peace. And as we know, peace is not the absence of conflict or the absence of problems and difficulties. It's actually being at peace in the midst of the storm, isn't it? We can't remove anxiety. We can't become a non-anxious presence by trying to fix all our problems, because every time we fix a problem, it's a bit like that game whack-a-mole. You know, we hit one on the head and another one pops up. So the only way we can actually find true peace is in the midst of the storm, in the midst of the things that we cannot change. And this reminds me again of Jesus' words, to seek first the kingdom of God. Seek first the kingdom, not seek control, not seek to be able to fix everything. Another phrase I love is, when fear is running the show, love is repressed. Maybe when anxiety is running in the show, love is repressed. So I've spoken a little bit longer than I wanted to. I'm sorry about that, but I get carried away with this stuff because I just think it's so important. And I'm teaching myself this stuff, honestly, and I've learned a lot of this stuff the hard way. So let's just take a moment to breathe. And could you just take a moment on your own now, just to write down one small step, maybe something I said just triggered something in you. So, oh yeah, well, I used to do that. You know, I used to meet up with that friend, or I used to do that fun thing, or a spiritual practice maybe that you used to do, whether that be journaling or daily office or whatever it might be, or silence. Just write down one small step that you actually will achieve, that is achievable. So write down one small step you will take today to move towards being a non-anxious presence. And if you're happy to share, then we'll just have a moment in a minute to share, but you can also put things in chat if you're happy to do that. Yeah, and 1 or 2 of you have commented, you know, it's hard to find such friends, absolutely. And it might be, maybe God might be challenging some of us to recultivate some friendships, you know, which might be a bit embarrassing to go back to someone after 5-10 years, not really being in touch. But you can be really honest with them and say, look, you know, I really value our friendship. I'm sorry I've not cultivated it, but I would really love to try and rekindle it. You know, how about it? And actually, that's relatively straightforward to do on Zoom. It's a bit less pressured than sort of meeting, you know, arranging to meet up somewhere.